technology might constitute something that should be regulated as a weapon or a means of warfare under the law of armed conflict, or whether it might be a weapon that should be of concern under international human rights law. And I ask the question because there are certain legal obligations that attach to development and use of weapons and means of warfare that don't attach to other equipment and other procedures that are done for military purposes. Some of those legal obligations are quite onerous. They apply to states who might employ these devices. Some apply to enhanced personnel themselves. They relate to how these weapons, means of warfare may be developed, the circumstances in which they may be acquired by a state, and how they're used by a state. So given that it would affect the development process, I think it's worth asking that sort of question early on. Now, I'm not thinking of implants as weapons in the ordinary sense of the word. I'm not thinking of devices that might be used to directly inflict harmful effects on an enemy. I'm just thinking of implants in, I guess, the sense that we all are, something designed to render a beneficial effect to the person utilising it, with the idea of enhancing their performance in combat in some way. But given that the general purpose of using an implant would be to affect how a soldier behaves in combat, and that we're still in very early days, it's really difficult to say what sort of effects we may see on the battlefield eventually, how pronounced those effects may be. I think it's worth asking the question of whether there might be circumstances where it could cross the line to become something that could be considered weapon development. So in this respect, I'm taking a fairly broad technology agnostic view of implantable technologies. I'm not thinking of a particular type of implant, whether we're thinking of implants that may affect a soldier's mental functioning, cognitive, sensory, or purely physical things. I'm really thinking of implantable technologies as, I guess, defined by their function as a class of devices or procedures that might affect how a soldier behaves, rather than a class of procedures that affect, have direct effects on third parties, on the enemies. Doing this because I'm wondering first if there are any general principles that may apply to implantable technologies to human enhancement in general, and also partly because it's just such early days, it's really difficult to ask specific questions about specific technologies. So what obligations am I asking about in particular? What applies to weapons but not other equipment developed for military purposes? The principle of distinction is one. That states that parties to a conflict must only use weapons that are capable of being directed at specific military targets and not at civilian targets, and they must in fact use those weapons only to attack military targets and not civilian people, civilian objects. Principle of proportionality states that a combatant, a soldier, must refrain from launching an attack where they would expect that attack to cause damage or injury to civilians that's disproportionate and it's excessive compared to the military advantage that might be obtained. So it's about how to use weapons. And there's also an obligation to avoid using weapons that are of a nature to cause superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering when used in combat. And that's very much a constraint on the design of weapons. And in support of those principles, there's an obligation on states to conduct reviews of the legal status of weapons during development, acquisition, and during use, and to take adequate precautions during the course of an armed conflict to ensure that any weapons are only being used in accordance with their legal obligations. So those particular obligations apply broadly to the category weapons, means and methods of warfare. And the key question, I guess, is whether there might be circumstances where implantable technologies or implantable devices might fall within the scope of what you could consider a weapon or means or something that affects a method of warfare. So in this case, a means of warfare generally refers to weapons and associated devices. methods of warfare refer to how weapons are used, so tactics, operating procedures and so forth. It's a fairly broad scope, generally understood to mean weapons in the widest sense, as well as the way in which they're used. It's not only a question about the formal designation of some technology or device, not just about whether we label it a weapon, but the judgment has to be made with respect to how we would normally expect the technology to be used in combat. In respect of weapon systems, the obligation to check for distinction, unnecessary suffering and so forth applies to all components of what we could consider a weapon system. So not just the part of the device that directly inflicts harm on an enemy, but all associated equipment, so targeting systems that may be used with a weapon, navigation systems, ISR type systems, anything that might reasonably influence the way in which a weapon operates in combat would be included in the obligation. Now, it's certainly not obvious that that implantable technologies would fall within this scope at first glance. But again, I'm asking this question because being very early days, and given that we're not talking about a specific effect on soldiers, but rather talking about an approach to achieving an outcome in combat, which is rather than building devices which may be used to inflict harm or achieve some end, we're talking about enhancing soldiers in ways that would allow them to go on and adopt some behaviour in combat. So it's sort of an indirect way of doing things, but it doesn't really, not really reference to what we might end up doing. So the sorts of questions we might ask to decide whether an implant or an implantable technology should be regulated as a weapon: could it plausibly constitute a component in a weapon system? That is, how closely might the effect of an implant or the effect of a modification on a soldier's behaviour be related to the weapon that they're using or how they're operating a weapon? Is the effect of an implant directly related to the way in which a weapon will operate, the accuracy with which it's used, the likelihood with which it's used, and so forth? Is that the intent of giving the implant to the soldier? Do they affect the manner in which a weapon is used, or the influence of choice of methods or tactics? And do they affect the ability of a soldier to adhere to the principle of distinction or principle of proportionality and so forth? And there I'd be thinking of implants that may have some cognitive effect. I remember there was an incident in Afghanistan where some Canadian soldiers were killed by friendly fire from an American F-16, and while this wasn't the point of law that was brought up in relation to that, I remember one of the F-16 pilots mentioned that because of the stimulant drug they'd been using, which I think was dexedrine, they were feeling very jittery at the time they decided that maybe it'd be worth dropping the bombs on what they thought was an enemy position, but wasn't. So questions come up there about, well, did the effect of that drug interfere with the targeting decision that was made by the pilots of those F-16s? There's also the question of allocation of control too, control over certain decisions. So the law states that people who plan or decide upon an attack need to take all feasible precautions in selecting targets, in choosing weapons and so forth. Where an implant has been given to a soldier, how do you allocate responsibility for the effect that that implant is having on the decisions that the soldier makes? Is it still entirely their decision? Do you need to think about the accountability of other parties who may be involved? I don't really know the answer to that. Even in situations that don't amount to armed conflict, I haven't really thought this through yet, but certainly the weapons are also regulated, or use of weapons is regulated under human rights law. enforced more stringently perhaps than under humanitarian law. And there's certainly concerns about the circumstances in which military personnel engage in, for example, a law enforcement role, might be using weapons. And there you have to think about any factor which may affect the likelihood that weapons can be used, how they might be used, and so forth. I haven't really thought that one through carefully yet. So those are just some of the questions that occurred to me about the boundaries of what might be considered weapon development in terms of implantable technologies. And this may become a paper, it may not, we'll see yet, but that's what I'm thinking. That's all I have to say. Any questions?
Thank you.